Hello, San Salvador. I'm doing my Jack Cruz impression. Hello, San Salvador. It's great to be here in the only monarchy in the Western Hemisphere by my count. And, as an American monarchist, this is a little bit of a dream come true that this place simply exists, and then to find that it's as successful as it is truly remarkable. And so I guess I want to talk about it feels like El Salvador is a monarchy, but I feel like there's still a lot to learn about monarchism in a way, because I feel that essentially, what happens when people have good ideas is you'll often see a lot of independent reinvention. And I feel that, when people try and do, the state as a work of art, solus populi suprema lex in the 21st century, they naturally, as they just pragmatically examine the situation, come up with a lot of old ideas that they basically reinvent themselves, which is great. On the other hand, if you see that phenomenon and know that phenomenon, the idea of, okay, what can we actually learn from the past pops out. And, essentially, I view, this little resurgence of a working, functional, very impressive monarchy in the modern world is it's a recovery in some ways from 250 years of really questionable thinking about governance. And the thing is, if we go back before that time period and we think about what does it mean to be a country, what does it mean to be a state, we basically encounter this gold mine as we get this Anglo-American, theory out of our systems. And so, one way to ask, the question, of course, we have these modern monarchies that are companies, right? And so, one way to ask the question of what to do with El Salvador is to say, what would happen if we had Steve Jobs or Sam Altman or some other, really effective modern monarch in charge of a country? But another way is another question we can ask is, what would Louis XIV do? Because Louis XIV actually found, inherited a country that was in a lot of turmoil and basically made it, the leading nation in Europe. And so I think that, if I love to recommend books. Obviously, books are long and hard to read, but the book that I always recommend essentially as a starting point for the classical theory of the nation is Vattel's Law of Nations. That's V-A-T-T-E-L, which is a wonderful summary of basically classical theory of the nation state before liberalism, before English liberalism really gets its hands on that theory. But it's late enough that Vattel was actually the standard textbook of, the American founders. So, because when you go back to the 18th century, people are starting to invent a lot of new ideas in the 18th century, but they're also, in some ways, unconsciously full of these old ideas. And so it's the old ideas that we need to find and remake. There was a great president of South Africa, Paul Kruger, who said, let us take what is good and noble from the past and use it to build the future. And, and that's essentially, the task here in, here in El Salvador, which is one of the most, one of the smallest, one of the most historically troubled nations in the Americas, with basically, not a whole lot of capital besides the fact that it's a country. And it's used the fact that it's a country to go from a frightening place. I mean, you can still see, you drive around San Salvador, there's all this barbed wire everywhere, right? And you're looking at that and you're just like, how long is it gonna take of the Bukele era for people to start realizing that their place would look a lot nicer without barbed wire? And 5 to 10 years, I don't know. It takes a long time for people to forget this kind of incredible reign of terror that went on here. And just showing that government can end the reign of terror is it's just an incredible step. And, you know, it's world historic. But, you know, I think in some ways, in a sense, it's only the start, or it should be only the start. So what I look at, there's sort of two parts to the theory, the classical theory of the state, that I want to go through. One of them is kind of an internal theory, and the other one is a kind of foreign policy oriented theory. And obviously, especially for a small country like El Salvador, foreign policy is super important. And let's talk about domestic policy first. So from the perspective of the classical theory of the state, one of the reasons why it's so easy to sort of go in the direction of a corporate analogy. I know President Bukele, you know, once had his Twitter feed say CEO of El Salvador, which is sort of exactly right. It's like you think of the nation as a firm. And when you see the nation as a firm, you're really stepping outside this kind of Lockean Anglo-American idea of sort of the, you know, the Republican, you know, government by consent idea, the government that works, you know, that sort of the people are in control of, that kind of represents the people. You're like, no, the state is a firm. And what are the assets of this firm? The assets of this firm are the land of El Salvador and the people of El Salvador and whatever's in the vaults over the National Bank over there. And those are tremendous assets. Those are amazing assets. Basically, even, you know, I don't think is El Salvador the smallest country in Latin America? Not quite, maybe Belize, you know. But it's not a big country. It's not a famous country. It's been for a while, occasionally been an infamous country, but it's a country. And so, you know, what can you do with that country? And the first thing the Bukele regime has done is to say, well, the fundamental purpose, the first and fundamental purpose of government is to have a monopoly on violence. And everything else needs to be, you know, subordinated to that. All of your ideas of like liberal democracy and juridical defense and the rule of law, you don't have the rule of law unless you have the rule of order. And that's something, you know, America has no shortage of gangs. We've got, you know, I think somewhere between 1 and 2 million gang members in the United States. That's an army. That's a giant frickin' army. And these people are loyal to their gangs rather than loyal to the US government. And like when you look at basically, now we don't quite have the advantage that you had in here in El Salvador, which is that basically they use tattoos as uniforms. So if you have a gang tattoo, you're in a gang. And if you don't have a gang tattoo, you're not in a gang. You know, and that's almost, as I understand, very, very reliable. You also have the advantage in El Salvador that the gangs here were not really narco gangs. They were basically devoted mainly to like small-time crime and extortion and basically charging taxes on their little neighborhoods. And so there's not this kind of there's not as much money in the gang business here as in this place like Mexico. But, you know, it was still, I mean, it's just an amazing achievement to sort of pull that down. And it's also, you know, reminiscent of, you know, what they call mano dura policies have failed many, many times, for example, in Honduras, you know, and, you know, of course, the liberals are just like, see, you can't repress the people will always fight back against your injustice. And you're just like, no, actually the hand wasn't hard enough. and like when the hand is hard, it's just like, you know, the feeling of you feel safe in this country. It's incredible, right? You can tell like the difference between, you know, being here in the historic center and being in, say, Sao Paulo in the historic center, night and day, right? You know, and that's a huge, huge transition. Okay, but let's go a little further with this in a sense. And we say basically that the nation is the owner of the people in a way that just totally spits in the face of Anglo-American liberal democratic thinking throughout history. And when you say the people, you know, the people of El Salvador are, you know, the land is great, beautiful place, you know, the people are still the primary asset. And so what you have to basically, if you're a responsible government, you know, and you subscribe to this pre-modern, you know, theory of the state and of society, you realize that it's your mission as the government to make sure everyone in the country realizes their full potential and is turned into the most like amazing person that they can become. And that's a hard problem, and it's an especially hard problem if you're not a believer in Anglo-American liberal egalitarianism. And you're like, that actually means different things for different people in many different ways. And so actually El Salvador, being a real country, has just a complete range of human beings in it. And like, you know, all of those human beings are the property of the state and the care of the state, and the state needs to maximize their human potential in terms of the contribution they can make. So, for example, if you go kind of from the upper class to the middle class to the lower classes, that means very, very different things for different groups of people. Now, you know, every country in the world essentially has an upper class. This is a class, you know, I hate to repeat any, you know, difficult heresies here, but the fact is the bell curve is real, IQ is heritable, and human beings have different potentials. And, you know, what that should tell, you know, us in the 21st century who have a sort of cultural liberalism that we can't really get beyond, and I'm not even sure should try to get beyond, is that basically, I mean, because this was also the thinking of like Charles I, like everyone at every level needs to flourish in that way. And so the thing is, when you're basically looking, for example, at, let's take the upper classes, okay? The main goal when managing the upper classes is to basically keep them. You want to keep their human potential. You want them developing the country. You want them working for the country. You don't want them in New York. And if you do have to send them to New York, you want them to come back. And that's a hard problem. And especially like you're dealing with this upper class, it's fundamentally a cognitive upper class. And because it's a cognitive upper class and heredity is by no means an exact science, what you're going to see is you're going to see people who are basically born into a cognitive elite all over the country in all classes, predominantly in the upper class, but also in all classes. And so, you know, one of the goals in kind of managing this upper caste elite is to basically find them all, find all of these kids, and basically bring them into, because it's a small upper class, you have to create a really powerful hothouse environment, basically, in which like the best of the best, you know, feel if they go, heaven help us, to MIT for college, they should feel like it's a step down. And the thing is, you know, just by the laws of mathematics, there are, we don't know who there are, but, you know, there are probably 50 or 100 kids in El Salvador right now who are in high school for whom MIT would be a step down. You need to find all those kids, and you need to own them, and you need to bring them into a place that basically maximizes their human potential, because they're out there and they're amazing and they're the property of the country. So, you know, it's like when I was a kid, of course, I was a libertarian. I was absolutely horrified by the Iron Curtain. It seemed like the worst thing in the world. And I didn't understand the rationale, you know, for that, which was essentially to prevent brain drain from the Eastern Bloc. Now, I'm not suggesting that El Salvador, you know, install an Iron Curtain, but what I am suggesting is that the value of keeping these people and keeping their assets and keeping their money in the country is absolutely enormous. And so actually, you know, I mean, making the country free of crime is a huge thing for people like this. But let's switch over in a way, you know, middle classes always need the least help from the state. They're sort of almost, if you're middle class, you're kind of flourishing by definition in a way. And it's really the lower classes that in the way need the most help and need the most care from the state. And so when we look at the lowest of the low, you know, we see all these famous pictures and videos of the gangbangers in the giant new prison, and they're all sitting like this, and they're moving in ways that make it clear that they have been trained that unless they do exactly what they are told, they will be hit. Which is really, very essential and the start of sort of order and discipline for these people. But the thing about these people is that, okay, not everybody in the lower class in El Salvador in the gang period joined a gang. Certainly true. Many people tried to live in a reasonable way. Many, of course, fled to the United States. Some people wound up in gangs. And the thing is, when you look at these gangsters, you have to say, to what extent are we looking at normal human beings or who have just been socialized into an insane system, or are you looking at people who are really psychopaths? Because if somebody is really a psychopath, basically, that's it. They have to be in close custody forever. They can't be released back on the street. But if someone is not a psychopath and just basically happen to live in a psychopathic environment, you basically want, that person, let's say he's like 25 now, by the time that person is 40, you want him to be a productive member of society who just remembers the crazy time that he was in. And, and how do you do that? You do that by basically adopting a very paternalistic, pre-modern system of governance. And of course, one of the big missing pieces that has basically been sort of destroyed in the modern world is the church. And, or the church is plural because, of course, Salvador has many evangelicals as well as Catholics. It's sort of amazing how, when you look, for example, at Elizabethan England, you're like, oh yeah, they're English, they're doing English things. And then you realize that this is a monarchical state. And as a monarchical state, it has a state church. And of course, even before there was an Anglican church, the state was aligned with the church. And one of the principles of having a state church is the church is the government of your personal life. The state is for crime, the state is for, whatever, but the institution that manages you as a human being, that makes sure you're on the up and up, is the church. And so, the sort of start of this thing you see, and I think that they're already in the prisons are religious study groups and people who find, God instead of gangs. That's great. But the thing is, it's expensive to hold people in these warehouses, and frankly, they could be working. They could be, I definitely have seen things in El Salvador that could be cleaned up by chain gangs. And absolutely. And the thing is, what is a chain gang essentially? Oh my God, a chain gang, right? What is a chain gang essentially? A chain gang is saying, okay, you have committed crimes, you've been a horrible person, even if you're not a sociopath or a psychopath, basically you've done psychopathic or sociopathic things. And so we are going to restore you to humanity. We are going to re-socialize you. And the first way that we're going to do that is you are going to have a lifestyle where you do basically two things. One of them is work and the other one is pray. And putting basically someone who, and that's going to be socially enforced. And so when you basically have this kind of enforced social structure around these kinds of people where they get basically used to being peers with people who exist in this world, you have to form them into groups. You have to have a lot of group psychology. Your basically path to becoming a human being probably starts with unskilled labor. Maybe you get trained in a trade. A lot of these people can do trades. Of course, El Salvador is well known for having hardworking people. That's one of their regional reputation issues, and most stereotypes are true. And so then you're like, okay, at what point is it possible to release these people onto the street? It would be nice to erase their tattoos. I realize that's kind of expensive, but maybe buy a laser and just run them through a few times. And it would be nice to erase their tattoos, maybe that's not a requirement. But the thing is, if these people are going out on the street, their whole universe needs to be monitored. If this person is going out on a street, they live in a place, People know where they live. They're probably in a barracks of some kind. They're in a situation where this basically system of like personal control that gives them absolutely no choice, but the straight path is retained. You're tracking them. You're air tagging them. You're making them piss in a cup. You're basically like exercising this kind of total level of control over these people, which is in a way similar to the kind of control that you had in a prison, but is basically set on sort of setting them on this kind of straight and narrow path as they kind of return to humanity. And, you know, for people who step off the path, you know, yeah, okay, this person is actually a problem. But my offhand guess is that at least 80% of these people could be rehabilitated. And like, but it's not a rehabilitation of love. It's a it's not a hippie kind of thing. It's basically like, you are gonna have to live in an orderly way. And we are gonna maintain this order of you. Actually, one of the first and most interesting colonial experiments in the New World was something called the Reductions of Paraguay, which was the Jesuit kingdom of Paraguay. And the Jesuits had this very interesting approach. I'm sure this is all very politically incorrect, but they had this very interesting approach to basically civilizing the local Guarani Indians. And their approach was to just basically regiment them in ways that made them basically live like Europeans. And what they found was that, you know, this could be done with basically pure-blooded Indian populations could be basically made to live like the European lower classes. And then the Jesuits got abolished and they went to hell. And Paraguay has never recovered. But you know, that feeling of basically you are taking people and like you as the state should be concerned when you're just like, here's a situation where I have a person in this country who is capable of more than they're giving or capable of being more than they're being and is not doing so. So one example of the kind of policy that basically, and this is more aimed at the middle classes, one example of the kind of policy that was very much practiced by Louis XIV and you know, has also been tried by various 20th century Latin American regimes is a policy of protectionism, is import substitution. Of course, you go around El Salvador, you see a lot of imports from China. Okay, you go around America, you see a lot of imports from China. You don't actually see a lot of imports from America. You have this situation where everything is made in China. So you're not alone here, Salvadorans, right? And basically what that's doing is basically that's saying, well, here is this product that maybe we could make ourselves. But if we made it ourselves, it would be more expensive, so let's spend some foreign exchange on it. That's true, but also if you made it yourself, you know, and the targets of this kind of import substitution have to be chosen very well. I'm not saying that, like, you know, El Salvador should produce its own phones made out of sand and software, right? You're not at that level yet, but there's a lot of things that basically you could essentially sort of progressively tariff into existence in the construction of genuine domestic industries, starting probably with light industries and working your way up. And that basically creates, when you have these industries, you're spending more money, your consumers are spending more money, you have less money leaving the country, and we'll get to kind of the foreign policy aspect in the moment. It's very crucial. Balance of payments is super important, and protectionism, of course, helps with that by definition. But the most important thing is that you're basically giving people productive lives. And we're in a situation in the world now where, you know, it's very strange because the necessity of sort of human beings is in question in ways that it has never been in the past. And that extends from like the manual labor that is, you know, replaced by machines, you know, steam shovels instead of shovels, all the way up to now we have AI, you know, bumping off graphic designers, basically. Bad time to be a graphic designer, you know, and so like making sure that your humans are useful and relevant is just a supremely important task. sending them abroad to, install drywall in California and send remittances back. Well, remittances are very important because that affects your balance of payments. But essentially, like whenever you look around you and you see people who are basically not living up to their human potential, that's the state wasting an asset, okay? And as a firm, you don't waste assets. And like, that, involves like the sort of creation and sponsoring of industries. For example, El Salvador has amazing coffee growing, basically land. And the Salvadoran coffee industry was, as far as I'm aware, like totally devastated by warfare and gang wars and war wars and all this 20th century nonsense. But you still have this amazing, amazing land for basically producing coffee plantations. But it takes a while for a coffee tree to grow. And so, basically, when I used to be a libertarian, I'm like, oh, well, the free market will take care of that. No, actually, I think that basically Louis XIV would very much disagree with that. Louis XIV are like, oh, the French are good at knitting tapestries. Let's establish, this amazing state, tapestry company. Protectionism and especially state industries have earned a bad name in a lot of ways. And the reason that they've earned a bad name is that they're very good for corruption. They very, very easily become corrupt. And because they're basically great ways to steal in all kinds of ways. And this is one of the advantages of a monarchy, which is that basically because the king owns everything, the king owns nothing. And if you're working for the king, basically, and like trying to feather your bed at the same time, like that, you're stealing from the king, basically, and you don't want to do that. And so, a lot of these systems where America tried to impose its system of government on the whole rest of the Americas and did that, very proactively, and like basically, doing democracy in, a Massachusetts town meeting has the effect of like opening everything up and having everyone, but like basically distributing authority in a third world country basically means no one's responsible, no one's in charge, and everybody steals. And the effect of like most people do not understand the power of a monarchy to eliminate corruption. And it's immense. I mean, another of the great stories, very different monarchy, very different kind of country, but MBS in Saudi Arabia sort of had, I mean, all third world countries have longstanding traditional elites, and there's a very wealthy elites in some ways, and a lot of these elites basically get into the stealing from the government kind of, routine, and that was very true in Saudi Arabia. And so what Mohammed bin Sultan did when he came to power was, the famous Ritz incident where he basically took all of the rich people in Saudi Arabia and said, you're going to declare all of your assets overseas, and we're going to investigate how you got them, and we're going to take them back. That was not popular in some circles, but he had the power to do it, and he did it, and he's created a really strong state there. Very different set of assets, right? But the thing is, if there's a question of like, what is the oil of El Salvador, it's obviously coffee. And, the sort of ability to basically say, it's just like, if there's land in the mountains that isn't being used for coffee production, why not? How do you fix that? Eminent domain, nationalized, just like basically, sure, private industry can build a coffee plantation. Okay, it's long-term financing. It takes a while for these trees to grow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You really can basically, by applying like startup tier management, like you can really supercharge that. And so, there's just a lot to do in terms of like, economically employing people in a way that maximizes their potential. There's a huge amount basically to do in that sense. And, you know, when you see people selling lottery tickets, you know, in little booths, you know, which was like a block over from over there, you're basically like, you know, okay, well, even that is better than being on welfare, honestly, because it's a job, it's doing something, but what could this person be doing? And that question is sort of in the mind of the kind of the actively managed state. The state is a work of art. You're always asking that question. Now, the other thing that Vattel covers, of course, is foreign policy. And the foreign policy of a state in the Latin American world is, of course, deeply, deeply tied up with its relationship with the United States. And I know this very well because actually my father was an American diplomat in the Dominican Republic at one point. And so, you know, I kind of saw that relationship actually from the other side in interesting ways. You know, there's a neighboring country, which is Nicaragua, you know, which had, as a kid and growing up in the 80s, I learned all about the evil Somoza regime. Somoza, it's a very strange sounding name to American ears. Anastasio Somoza. And I picture him this like fat Jabba the Hutt, like toad creature, like eating babies, you know, and I was somewhat surprised to discover in later life that Anastasio Somoza, or Tony as he was called, spoke perfect English and had gone to West Point. And, you know, he was basically actually an American almost in a way. I mean, anyone who's gone to West Point is kind of an American. And, you know, one of the things, of course, Somoza was overthrown by communists and then shortly after that killed by communists. But he did something interesting in his relationships with the US State Department. After he was dethroned, but before he wrote a book, before he was murdered in Paraguay, you know, probably with some kind of American complicity, he wrote a book. And in this book, there's something wonderful, which is basically when the State Department went to see Tony Somoza and tell him to do stuff, he taped them. He actually taped them. And so, you know, that's basically, I mean, the closest thing that you can see to that is reading the WikiLeaks cables and kind of watching the State Department at work. And, you know, if you're an independent country anywhere in the world, like the State Department is your enemy. Their goal is to basically reduce you to dependence. And what's amazing about basically the Bukele regime is that in some ways it's like the dog that didn't bark because, you know, I can tell you that if you tried to do this stuff in the 1980s, you'd end up the same place as Somoza. You know, but it's not the 1980s anymore. And so what's surprising, you know, I was down in Sao Paulo a little while ago talking to some based Brazilians. And of course, you know, everyone in Latin America is like, how can we do this? How can we get away with this? Because, you know, the whole kind of Monroe Doctrine psychology of being essentially an American protectorate. I mean, if you read, you know, you read Vattel and you basically say, okay, what does the Monroe Doctrine mean in the context of Vattel? What it means is that you are a protectorate. Okay, there was never any real independence in Latin America per se. Latin American independence was established by the Monroe Doctrine, which was actually a British foreign policy. And this British foreign policy was after the Napoleonic Wars. Britain decided that it wanted the commercial revenues from Latin America. There's a reason why everyone in Latin America plays football, which is an English village sport. How did that happen? Were you colonized by the English? Well, kind of. You know, Buenos Aires was certainly a commercial colony of England. And basically liberating the Latin American regimes from, you know, the Holy Alliance, you know, Spain and Portugal, and of course they were also installing liberal regimes there, was basically a way of saying, okay, since you're not going to be part of the Spanish Empire anymore, and since your independence is protected by the Royal Navy, you're a protectorate. And as a protectorate, you've actually already lost your sovereignty. And so, you know, when I say basically El Salvador has this amazing piece of capital, which is its sovereignty, it has sort of nominal United Nations style sovereignty. But actually what it's trying to do is something quite different and quite amazing, which is to restore actual sovereignty, which is a thing that basically has not been seen for quite some time in these parts. And what you see in sort of the historical evolution of the Monroe Doctrine is this sort of tightening of control up to. So at first it's like, okay, these Latin American countries can't be subject to European monarchs. Okay, then, you know, at a certain point they're like, well, we could have our own monarchs. We could have an empire of Brazil. Nope, not allowed, right? You know, and then you're like, okay, we're not going to have emperors and kings, but we'll just have caudillos, you know, and they'll basically be kings in all but name, but we'll call them presidents, and we'll have a constitution that looks like the American Constitution. For a while, that was fine. Not allowed. No more military coups. You know, the idea of like, you know, think about what, you know, the situation must be. Let's say you're you know, a colonel, a general, something in the Brazilian army. And you're basically looking at this country where, you know, the favelas in Rio are actually, the government is the gang. Like, you know, the government is literally the gang. And you're just like, and they have very close relationships with the PT, the elected government of Brazil. And so you're basically like, this is a country that does not control its own territory. This is a country where, you know, if you're, you know, part of the upper class in Sao Paulo, you sort of go from like security bubble to security bubble. It's crazy. And so they're basically like, how could we do what the Salvadorans have done? And it's actually terrifying to contemplate in some ways, because the instinctive reaction among anyone, I mean, these countries, Latin American countries, have very old military traditions. They have very old traditions of like military governance that have vanished, you know, in many ways from the rest of the world. And of course, the instant kind of impulse of anyone who sees the world in military terms is like, oh my God, we could just restore order. And then you're like, oh my God, we could just restore order. And if we restore order, what's going to happen? Well, the Fed is going to cut off our banking access, and there's going to be sanctions, and there's going to be like, you know, the State Department and the CIA are going to start supporting urban guerrillas. And, you know, the country, all of our intellectuals will desert us. They'll all hate the government. And you're basically descending into like, you know, dirty war, Brazil in the 60s, Argentina in the 60s and 70s kind of territory. And they're just like, yeah, okay, no, we can't do that, you know. And so it's like Bolsonaro, you know, he sort of talked about crossing the Rubicon, and I'm sure he had he'd been in the army himself. I'm sure he had conversations with, you know, many military leaders about what he could do there, and eventually he decided that what he could do was nothing. And I'm not entirely sure he was wrong, but I'm not entirely sure he was right either, because I think there's a lot of ways, and I think one of the things sort of internationally that the Bukele experience demonstrates the most is that basically when sort of potential indigenous leaders kind of look at this relationship with the State Department, none of them want to get samosa'd. You know, they sort of all have this kind of rising tide of like increasing control, de facto control from Washington. I mean, the purpose of the American embassy in every country is to supervise the government of that country. And to tell it, it's soft power, it's not hard power, it's not the Warsaw Pact. They don't give orders. They're just like, wow, you know, this is really disappointing to us. Or like, you know, and then you sort of see the consequences, right? And that system of control, you know, which has worked so well for so long, is kind of breaking down a little bit. It's actually gotten a lot weaker. It's like an old lion. He still kind of roars, like, you know, oh my God, you're locking up people without a trial. Oh my God, Americans will never stand for that, right? You know, and the thing is, you know, you can say like Americans will never stand for that, right? But what is the actual energy behind that? And what are the actual consequences? Well, what are the consequences for El Salvador? A little bit of trouble with IMF, you know, but like, can the State Department really like start a leftist revolution in your country? No, they can't. They're no longer capable of it, right? And so, you know, you certainly have a situation where, you know, Bukele has, let's say Bukele has 90%, you know, popular support, and, you know, 5% of those, of the 10% are friends and family of gang members, and the other 5% went to Harvard, and I exaggerate slightly, right? But the thing is, that problem of basically making sure that your upper classes are loyal to San Salvador and not to Washington or to New York or to London or to the outside world, that's a huge, huge problem. And that's a problem that, for example, Russia has had for much of its history, the sort of divide between the intellectual classes and the governing classes. And so, basically, like, recapturing these governing classes is a very important aspect of recapturing sovereignty. But you also, like, it's worth remembering that, like, the years of lead are just over. Like, what made these, like, urban guerrilla movements, or rural guerrilla movements possible in the 60s and 70s were a whole lot of factors, including, like, the existence of the Soviet Union and all of these things that just don't exist anymore. And so when I look at sort of what El Salvador has done kind of on the international scale, I'm basically, it's like, you had this, like, deadly lion that everyone was afraid of for 200 years. And, like, El Salvador is just like, I have no alternative but to walk into the lion's cage and see if he's going to eat me. And actually, he didn't eat. His teeth are all gone. They're not all gone. You still don't want to mess with him. You still want to treat the United States with a lot of care and a lot of respect. It is a very dangerous enemy, and you need to stay, as much on its good side as it can, because it's very big and strong. But the thing is, you can defy it in this really fundamental way by establishing what is a de facto monarchy, and it's clearly like a monarchy that works. And so everyone has sort of been taught to expect, like, from, like, a totalitarian dictatorship. There's an equivalent in Africa, which is Paul Kagame's regime in Rwanda. Also a very troubled country, like, full of war, genocide, whatever. And Kagame got a pass from the international community because of that. Like, the rule for Africa is, like, no strong men. You have to have weak men, only weak men. Only weak men, no strong men. Definitely don't have a strong government, have a weak government. We love that. And the result is just barbarism and chaos and terror and trash, and lots of trash, right? And if you go to Rwanda, basically, Kigali is, like, probably the safest city in Africa, probably including North Africa. And, like, the streets are spotless. Everybody in the country has, like, there's, like, one day of, like, pick up the streets, basically. And the whole ethnic conflict is gone. Like, talking about what tribe you're in Rwanda is like talking about gangs in El Salvador. You just don't do it, And so everything is kind of healing in this way. And when, Westerners look at this and they see this, strong man. Oh my God, he's strong. He's strong. They see this strong man and they expect this, like, world, like, where, like, somewhere there's a gulag full of dissidents, right? Where do you keep the dissidents? Like, the dissidents have to be imprisoned. No, they don't. They actually don't. They can just complain a little. They don't have to be imprisoned. They'll be like, oh my God, this is totally wrong according to the Harvard School of Latin American Studies, but they're not planting bombs. They're not starting armed guerrilla movements. Like, those days are over. And so, it actually is possible to, in this age, to basically have a strong government that just doesn't match any of these kind of dark, kind of convictions about, like, the totalitarian, dictatorship, fascism state, and it, like, this is a long sort of trend where you basically look at these, really bad mid-20th century dictatorships, and you're just like, wow, that's really bad. And then you're like, no, actually, they're fighting this incredible, like, civil war, like, just by existing. And so, for example, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the last Bourbon monarchy in Naples, I think they made a mistake of imprisoning a few dissidents, and they had William Gladstone, the UK Prime Minister, come out and he called the Bourbon regime, quote, the negation of God, unquote. And obviously, if you're the Royal Navy, doing something about the negation of God is like a thing. And so, what happens is Garibaldi. And Garibaldi conquers the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies with only 300 men in red shirts and the Royal Navy, but also the Royal Navy. And so, that feeling of basically when you see, like, the dying monarchies of the past sort of struggling to exist in this Anglo-American world that's growing stronger and stronger and stronger every day, you're kind of like sympathetic to them in a way, because what happens if you don't lock up those dissidents? Oh, you get the revolution, even sooner, right? And the thing is, realizing that in the 21st century, that whole, like, the time has changed, and that whole sort of revolutionary fire, now that it's conquered the world, is dying. And so it is possible to have a regime like Bukele's. It is possible to have a regime like Kagame's. And people look at this from the outside and they're like, how can this be allowed? And I'm like, they're just countries. Because basically, again, going back to where I started, with Vattel, like, one of the basic principles of the law of nations is that nations deal with each other as peers and as equals, and they basically don't, your relationship with your people as a country is not the business of this other country. If this other country makes it its business, then what you're going to see is that basically that's a hostile act. That's an act of, like, imagine you have, like, friends who are a couple, right, but you have the hots for the wife or the husband, and so they get into an argument, and you're just, like, trying to mediate the argument, but actually your goal is, like, something else, right? And that's sort of the relationship that the US has to all these, like, dictators and their human rights abuses, is basically, it sort of purports to be a purely charitable interest. But there's another famous conversation involving the South African Prime Minister Paul Kruger, who I mentioned earlier, where this is sort of before the outbreak of the Boer War. The great English diplomat Lord Milner comes to talk to Kruger, and he's basically like, who has his own independent Boer state way out in the backwoods, and Milner's like, oh, we just need this, we just need that, we need the other thing. And Kruger looks at him and says in his hard South African accent, he's like, what you want, Mr. Milner, is my country. And like, whenever state is basically pulling these things, like, they don't even think this way to themselves, it's just their way of thinking, but what they want is your country. And they don't want to, like, they want to make your country a better place. That's the theory of it. But in practice, they don't actually care. They don't suffer any consequences if they make the world a worse place. So, one good example of this, which is sort of worth remembering, this is kind of the last time the tiger showed its teeth, is the Arab Spring. And, in the Arab Spring, one of the things you notice is very interesting. The dictatorships are basically mostly destroyed by Washington. The old traditional monarchies survive. And that's sort of one illustration of kind of, when you are not able to say we're a monarchy because you're afraid to say that because Washington is going to step on your head, like, that creates a kind of weakness. And that weakness basically is just an incitement to all kinds of rebellion and, and it's an incitement to, honestly, the State Department that loves to support these things. And when you look at the, sort of why the Arab Spring happened, I had this one, I was talking with a kid from Syria who was in some kind of, startup, contest in 2014 or something. And, this is obviously, this kid has been sent from Syria to San Francisco. He's like the best that Syria has. Obviously an amazing kid. Maybe his startup isn't the best startup in the world, but I, go up and talk to him, afterward. And because I'm a crass person, I only wanted to talk about politics and not about his startup. And I was like, talked about Syrian politics. And I was like, do you know why the State Department started a civil war in Syria? And I forget what he said, but in the Arab world, it's a world of conspiracy theories, and everyone's like, well, there's like a cushion. Really, what they wanted was this pipeline from Afghanistan for the oil, but they couldn't, right. It is true that the US is still selling Syrian oil, by the way. But I don't think that's the motivation, and I was like, because they could. And ultimately, when people are exercising power, because they could is a sufficient answer. And what happened in the Arab Spring was that you had an older generation of American diplomats who had kind of gotten used to making exceptions for people like Mubarak and Assad, and they were like, okay, not democracy, okay, it calls itself democracy, not democracy, we don't like that, we don't like it at all, but like stability, Israel, let's keep a lid on it, and we have to like prop up these dictators. And when you ever hear of the US being criticized for propping up a dictator, what it means is they're not overthrowing him right now. And so a new generation came in with Obama, and they basically looked at the Arab world and they're like, holy crap, these are dictators. We're propping up these dictators, meaning not overthrowing them right now. Let's overthrow them right now. And the thing is, when you have Barack Obama wheeled out and on his teleprompter it says, Assad must go, Mubarak must go, or whatever, you know, it's never going to happen, but you could wheel him out and have him give a speech about Germany, and he would be like, Merkel must go. And he could probably start a civil war in Germany that way. And like, that's sort of, you know, that's the power of like soft power. Now, those places are sort of more tinderboxy still than Latin America. I don't think that the State Department could start a civil war in El Salvador. I don't think they could. You know, they could cause a lot of, you know, they could cause more economic problems. They could get really crazy with sanctions. They're not going to. There's sort of no domestic constituency that cares enough about that. You know, the way to deal with them is just like treat them as the big dog. Don't piss them off too much, but like, you know, don't let them dominate you, basically, because that's what they want to do. And like Bukele's done an absolutely admirable job of that. And like when you look at him basically getting like bad press, like there was this Economist story a few months ago where it's just like, wow, yeah, the country is at peace, but my human rights, you know, and you know, but it's not, it's like a gentle thing. It's not like you have this huge kind of, you know, campaign like the anti-Israel campaign or, you know, the anti-South Africa campaign gearing up to basically overthrow the Bukele government. The potential for that doesn't exist. And so I feel that it's sort of only a matter of time before more people in more Latin American countries realize on a much larger scale, because they're much larger countries, hey, we could just do this. And like when they're at like, hey, we could just do this, I mean, the neighboring you know, countries even, you know, right next to here in Central America. I mean, this used to be part of Gran Colombia, I think. You know, you look at Guatemala next door, used to be the same country. You know, I had a friend of my late wife's about 10 years ago went down to Guatemala to teach English on a State Department fellowship, teaching English for like journalism or whatever. She goes down, she's a typical San Francisco liberal. You know, she goes down to Guatemala City. She has to live like a prisoner, basically. She comes back. She's like, maybe what they need is another dictator, you know? And so it's really, it's like, it's not hard to see these things. And so, you know, in a way, El Salvador is sort of doing this like very classic American thing that the Puritans did when they came to New England, which is, you know, the old line, a city on a hill, you know, shall not be hid. Right, and so when you're building a city on a hill, I guess it's literally a city on a hill, you're basically sending this message of literal like soft power. Because actually, like, I don't think it's wrong to think of El Salvador as exercising soft power. You know, take an Uber anywhere in the Americas and talk to your Uber driver about Bukele. You know, and if they're Hispanic, they'll be like, we love him. Like, I've tried this experiment like numerous times, right? They'll always be like, we love them. And so the potential for basically that revolution to spread, and also for it to basically restore a lot of the ancient wisdom of just how to do monarchism right and how to create a state that's a work of art. You know, I think that, you know, like, as I said earlier, America has some of the same problems. The United States has some of the same problems that El Salvador had. And like, we can look at El Salvador, and American people and American politics look at El Salvador and they're like, hey, wait, they solved that. It's gone. It's over. It's done. You know, and so the ability to do that is considerable. Also, the ability to do, I think there's a lot of potential, and this is a long-term effort, reverse brain drain. So what does reverse brain drain mean? Reverse brain drain means, and this is sort of something that you see in, Bukele policies, and you see in this room, right? Here are American brains or brains from the rest of the world coming to El Salvador. Why is it? Because like they have something here that we don't. And so your ability to, it's like you look at, for example, charter city projects like Prospera in Honduras, right? And, like I said this to the Prospera guys at the time. I'm like, basically, your problem is your relationship with the government. And they're like, we have a good government. It'll be fine. It'll be cool. The good conservative government was overthrown by a leftist government. And the primary goal of this leftist government, which is like supposedly there to like help the people and, all these things, even, sort of the same kinds of things that I talked about. The primary goal of this leftist government is getting rid of Prospera. And this like tiny thing that's harming no one. But the thing is, what it's actually harming is it's sort of standing as this kind of counterexample to the way that the Harvard School of Latin American Studies thinks that Latin America should be governed. And because of that, it's this tremendous irritant, and it produces like great energy for the leftist government to try to destroy it. And I'm like, okay, yeah, you started that before Bukele, but like, look at all of El Salvador. This is a charter country. And the ability for basically a charter country to pull in people from the world and have that be a place to be based. I'm like, here I'm in El Salvador, the weather's great. An Uber ride costs $5 where it would cost $30 in America. Why don't I live here? Right? And the more people the more you see that kind of why don't I live here energy, that's a thing that builds really slowly, because basically, becoming an expat and like colonizing a sort of, new place it's a bold decision when no one else has done it. The more people do it, the more it becomes like a reality, and it sure is good for your balance of payments. The last thing that's like really important to say about sort of the state as a firm or the state as a monarchy is essentially your balance of payments is your profit and loss. Okay, if you're taking in more money than you send out, you're turning a profit, and that's good. If you're losing money, okay, maybe there's a reason for it. Maybe you can afford the debt, but like, you are so much stronger, like politically in a foreign policy context if you don't have to borrow money from people. And, eliminating that and making that, making El Salvador sort of like a kind of, maybe a new Panama almost in a way is like, that's a 10 to 20 year mission. But like, anyone who's seen pictures of China 20 years ago versus China now knows what you can do on that time horizon. So essentially, like, and as far as the political stability of the government, it's pretty hard to overthrow a government with 90% support. That's one of the big reasons why the State Department can't really do anything here, is that, basically the people have seen the difference. And you just can't, no matter how slick and American and like, professorial you are, basically, those people have snowed the world very effectively. They're very good at it. But when you see the difference, you're just like, no. Nothing's going to change your mind about that. And that's really the miracle that's happened here in El Salvador. Is that a good stopping point, Michael? Sure. All right. Questions?